You're watching Cherry Red TV. My name's Mark Powell and I'm the label manager of Cocteau Recordings, who on the 25th of November this year are releasing a box set by Bill Nelson, The Practice of Everyday Life. It's an 8 CD set which covers a 40-year career going back to 1971, and I'm pleased to say that with me today is Bill Nelson. Hello Bill, thanks for coming along to Cherry Red TV.
My pleasure.
I suppose starting off, you've probably been asked this before, but when you started off in 1971 making one of the very first sort of home recorded albums really in Northern Dream, did you foresee having a career where people would be talking about that 40 years on?
No, not at all. I mean, I originally planned to be an artist, a painter. I studied fine art, and that I thought would be the course that my life would go down. But music became kind of more important to me, I guess, at one point. But even then, the idea of having a career as a musician, I lived in Wakefield, a northern market town, and I didn't know of anybody in Wakefield who had ever sort of gone into that kind of thing and made a success of it. So it seemed out of reach. And when Northern Dream was made, the solo album, my first ever recording under my own name, it was just done as 300 copies, and almost for friends and family, if you like. There was no great ambition. So it was fortunate that things, it led to other things, but there certainly was no grand master plan at the time.
So could you give us a bit of a background just to what sort of led up to the making of that album and what you've been doing just immediately prior to Northern Dream?
Yeah, well, it was recorded at a little studio in Wakefield that was really, it was a bedroom in a man called Mike Levin, his house, and he had started a little label called Holy Ground Records, and the studio was known as Holy Ground, and they'd recorded local folk musicians, and a kind of when the mid-60s thing turned into the hippie era, there was a kind of a hippie commune living there. They were all students, teacher training students, but musicians as well. So there was this kind of collective of people who would gather at Holy Ground Studios, and a couple or three of the guys would write songs and other people would play on them. And I got involved kind of almost by accident and ended up playing on a couple of things. At that time I had not really written anything of my own, and I had a band called Global Village, a trio, a kind of a psychedelic blues trio. And so I got involved with the Holy Ground community and playing on some of the albums that they were making. But none of it was my music, and I was only on a couple of tracks. And then, the idea came that perhaps I might do something myself. And that's how Northern Dream started. And in fact, Northern Dream was really the first batch of songs that I'd seriously had a go at writing. So not only is it the first album I've ever recorded, it's probably the first collection of songs I'd ever written as well.
Really?
Yeah.
So when when you had the albums pressed up, you sent a copy to John Peel, who then picked up on the album. Yeah,
I think I did send it. Things get confused in the mists of time. I've sometimes said that John Peel found a copy somehow, but I think probably I took a chance on sending him one, because I used to be a big fan of his programme anyway. And out of the blue, I got a letter from him saying, listen to the show tonight. And he played the entire album, both sides, without a break, apart from saying, I'm now going to turn it over and play the other side. And that was just, I mean, I can't explain to you how much of a thrill that was for me, I mean, at that point in time, I was working as a local government officer. I'd left art college because, and abandoned the idea of being an artist because my father had become ill and had to stop working. So I got a job working as a local government officer and hated it. You know, I just hated the idea of doing it, but thought I was stuck with it forever. And then John played this Northern Dream album on his show, and EMI Records heard it. A guy called David Croker, who was an A&R man at EMI at the time. And eventually they got in touch with me with a view to re-recording it with session musicians in a proper studio. But there was kind of a bit of a time before that came about, but it was through John Peel, basically. Yeah.
So by the time you were approached by EMI, had you already, by that time, started to form Bebop Deluxe?
I mean, literally, I think I'd put the band together 2 weeks before they got in touch. And they got in touch about re-recording Northern Dream, and I said, well, you know, I've cut my hair and shaved my beard off and got a band, and it's completely different. And they said, okay, have you got anything we can listen to? So we went into Holy Ground and we demoed a couple of tracks, the first couple of things I'd written for the band, and sent that down to them, and they said, well, we think it's early days yet, and maybe we need to give you a few months to get things together a bit more, and then we'll come up and see you play live. So that happened. They came up to see us play, and by this time we'd started to build a good following. But they felt that the band as a whole wasn't right, and that I should work with different musicians. They were happy to do a deal with me, but not with the whole band. And I was very altruistic and sort of, you know, idealistic, and said, oh, it's the band or nothing. So they said, okay, well, we'll give you some more time, see how the band comes along, we'll come up and see you again. And this went on for quite a while, I think over a year. They'd occasionally, every few months, they'd pop up to see how we were doing. And gradually the band's following locally got very, very positive. You know, we packed all the places out we played locally. And I remember one of the higher A&R men saying, well, it's just a local phenomenon, it would never happen in London, this. So it looked like nothing was going to come of it. And then we played, we landed a gig at the Marquee Club, supporting a band called String Driven Thing. And the EMI chaps came along to see how we would fare with the London audience. And it was an amazing night. We just, you know, really burned the place down. Mm-hmm. And so they came backstage afterwards into this tiny dressing room at the Marquee and said, right, come in the office tomorrow, we'll do a deal. So that's how we got our record deal with EMI.
So when you recorded the first album, Axe Victim, the songs that you included on that album, were they things that you'd had written for some time, or were they some songs you'd written especially for the album?
No, well, they were the first batch of songs that I'd written for the band before EMI sort of got in touch, and we had been playing them, I think, you know, just over a year or so. Around the circuit in Yorkshire. We'd gone up to Northumberland, I think, on one or two occasions, and we had done, before the Marquee, we'd done one small pub in London, I seem to remember, but mostly we were a Yorkshire-based band, and the material had been toured around that area, and we'd built up a following, and I'd already started to write the songs that would end up on the band's second album, and was kind of more keen on the direction we were going in. Because when we started, I mean, we were for our sins, we were a glam rock band, but it wasn't done with any great deal of seriousness. It was kind of a way of confronting certain stereotypes about the kind of bands that were around in Yorkshire at that time. And it was right on the cusp of when that was starting to happen as well. I'd always been an art student, always been kind of fashion conscious and picked up on things immediately. Something looked like it was coming through, I'd jump on it, you know. But with the glam thing, it was just a bit of fun. And yet, when we got the deal with EMI, we were told that it would be best to record the songs that we'd been touring around with, because that was the material that had built up our following at that time, such as it was, and that there was an audience awaiting those songs on a record, so it would give us a start.
Yes, yeah.
So I had to kind of back off the newer material and just record the stuff that went on to Axe Victim. And it was always like that from then on. I always, and I've said this in interviews before, the band was always one step ahead of the release whatever album
Right,
we released,
yes.
I'd already
Yeah.
come up with the next thing.
concept
Yeah,
or the next
yeah,
next album.
Yeah, yeah.
Because between Axe Victim and Futurama, the lineup of the band went through a number of changes, and then changed drastically by the time you came to record Futurama. Why did that come about? Was that sort of record company influence partly, or?
Well, whilst EMI had signed the band as such, they still felt that, you know, it wasn't ideal, the level of musicianship or whatever, I don't know. And I kind of thought it was okay. But then we went out on tour supporting Cockney Rebel, who were doing very well at that point in time. They had top 10 singles, and I was very impressed with Cockney Rebel's professionalism, and touring with them and watching them every night, I did sort of see that experience was you know, something I should think about. And at the end of the tour, decided, with some encouragement from EMI, to think about changing the lineup of Bebop Deluxe. And two of the guys in Cockney Rebel, Milton Ream James and Paul Jeffries, keyboards and bass, wanted to join Bebop. So I split the band and put Milton and Paul in, and Milton knew a drummer called Simon Fox, because Milton was from Birmingham originally as Simon, and he had played in Birmingham together. And we got together and rehearsed, and we did about, I can't remember how many dates, but maybe half a dozen dates or something. And whilst we got on fine as people, it felt uncomfortable. It didn't gel musically for me. And I thought, well, you know, if I'm going to make these changes, it's got to be right. So decided to keep Simon, because I liked the way Simon operated drum-wise, and I'd looked for a bass player, and we auditioned lots of bass players, and eventually came across Charlie Tumahai, who'd come over from Australia with a band I think called Mississippi, and he was looking for something different to do. And immediately we got Charlie into the audition. It was instantly obvious that this was the guy, you know. I mean, he kind of looked like Hendrix at the time. He had a huge afro and grinned all the time when he was playing, had a really positive approach. So we were a trio then for a while, and we actually went out and did dates as a trio and began recording Futurama as a trio. This is before we started looking for a keyboard player. And then, because I'd played some keyboards and written a lot of the Futurama material on keyboards rather than guitar, we had to look for a keyboard player, again audition people, and then Andy Clark was the one we chose, and then we became a four-piece again.
So with the stylistic change that happened with Futurama, you began to explore the studio possibilities more. How much was that down to what you wanted to do yourself, or to Roy Thomas Baker, or was it a mixture of everyone sort of throwing ideas in the pot?
I guess it was a mixture of a lot of things. We had a superb engineer on that album, a guy called Pat Moran, and Roy had a lot of success with Queen and was a bit of a star producer at the time. And we didn't always see eye to eye. No disrespect to his abilities as a producer, but personality-wise we maybe had a few clashes. But Pat Moran was a solid rock, you know, someone who just did the job and did it extremely well, very talented engineer. So I had a lot of ideas in terms of arrangements and structure and so on, and we were able to do a lot of layering of parts, which Pat had worked on the Queen stuff as well, so there was suddenly, if you want to add another part, you know, we have the ability to do that, and so things were built up, and it became a very slick and grandiose kind of production album. I still think that Made in Heaven on that particular album is one of Bebop's jewels. It's a really special, concise track. But yeah, it did make things much more adventurous than it had been with the Axe Victim album.
Because that was released as a single at the time, wasn't it? Made in Heaven.
It was,
and
yeah.
then EMI push it again a little later on the
Yeah.
Hot Vowels EP. Again, it
That's
never
right.
seemed to sort of
Yeah.
do the trick.
Yeah, well,
really.
I don't know why, because to me that you know, it's a perfect pop single in some ways. Even though I did write it myself, I'm quite happy to denigrate other singles we've done in later years. But that one was a little pearl, I think. Yeah.
No, it's interesting. A few people I know, a few commentators say exactly the same thing. That it probably is one of the in what is it, about 2 minutes and 35 seconds or something,
short,
and
yeah.
it just says everything.
Yeah,
isn't it?
packs it all in there.
Yeah. So the step up from Futurama then to Sunburst Finish saw you co-produce the next album with John Leckie. Can you explain how that came about, the collaboration with John?
Yeah, well, I kind of approached, well, I did approach EMI with a proposal that perhaps they should let me produce the band's third album, which became Sunburst Finish, and probably rightly they felt that I hadn't had enough experience in sort of major studios yet to do that. But they suggested that I could perhaps co-produce it with someone else, and they had a staff engineer called John Leckie, who up to that point in time hadn't done any production work, but they felt he was about ready to make the move from engineer to producer. There was a kind of a hierarchy at Abbey Road at that time, with, you know, you start as a T-boy, then a tape op, and then an assistant engineer, then an engineer, and some way down the line, if you're lucky, you might make the jump to producer. So they suggested that John and I co-produce, and that we could, you know, teach each other different things. So I did know John very briefly from the Axe Victim sessions, because John had worked on a couple of the tracks, engineering on some mixes, and we'd got on quite well when he was engineering on those tracks. And so EMI put us together, we had dinner and had a chat about how we might approach it, and it seemed it was going to be something that was comfortable for us both. So that was John's first foray into production, and mine too, and we continued to work together through the rest of Bebop Deluxe's albums as co-producers. And
that album was I suppose, in terms of chart breakthrough, the chart breakthrough for Bebop Deluxe, and also then got you some interest in the States as well. Yeah. And you, of course, had the hit single "Ships in the Night."
Yeah.
Did you find the audience? Did that change the audience that you were getting?
I guess it did to some degree. You know, although we had released Made in Heaven as a single, I didn't really think of us as being primarily a singles band. We were an albums band in my imagination. But there was a certain amount of encouragement from the record company to think about singles. So when the Sunburst Finish album material was being written, I kind of, almost tongue-in-cheek, wrote what I thought might be a hit single, and that was Ships in the Night. I wrote it on a Wurlitz electric piano, and to be honest, it's perhaps my least favourite of all the Bebop Deluxe recordings, but it was the one that seemed to capture a broader audience's attention. And you know, we made our top of the pops appearance with that, and it helped the album tremendously, because people bought the album because of the single, and the rest of the stuff on the album went into various other areas. So hopefully it took some of the audience with us, you know, into those other areas. But even to this day, it's kind of a bit of an albatross for me.
I can imagine.
But you know, I have to be grateful to it, because it did give us that little kick we needed.
So was it shortly after that you did your first tour of America? And how did you find the experience there? Because that in turn went on to influence the next Bebop Deluxe album in some way, the title track of that.
I mean, I was looking forward to touring America with a lot of excitement. I grew up with a lot of American pulp comic book images and science fiction and so on, and musicals, old Hollywood musicals, and you know, the idea of that romantic notion of America was very firmly set in my mind. And of course, when we actually got there, it was quite different. In many ways, it was much more of a foreign country than I expected. although the language, you know, same more or less, but the attitudes were different, and it was quite a shock, really. I mean, I enjoyed it, but it was rather like going to another planet, and that prompted some songwriting that came out on a later album. There's a thing called the Modern Music Suite, which is on the Modern Music album, and that is literally sort of inspired by touring America. And of course, you don't really see America when you're touring. You see a kind of an artificial version of it, because you're either in a hotel or an aeroplane or an airport lounge or on stage or in a dressing room or in a radio station, but you're not actually out there seeing it as it really is, you know. So all that artificial quality found its way into this Modern Music Suite, and particularly some of the characters we met in the industry, you know. There was a chap who worked for Capitol Records, because the album was released on Capitol in the States, and Andy, the keyboard player, was very good at impersonating people, and did an impersonation of this guy on a spoken section of the Modern Music Suite. So there's lots of sort of little humorous sides and things, in jokes for the band in there.
Because you were by that point on quite a sort of a treadmill of just touring and recording.
It was, yeah. Album tour, and then you get maybe a month or 2 months at the best off at different points, you know, spread out, but mostly it was work all the time.
So were you writing songs on the road as you were doing that?
Not originally, but as things became busier and busier, then that had to be, I mean, it was hotel room writing, you know, for the latter part of the band's career. Initially that wasn't always the case. I did get time to write at home, but yeah, I was on the road a lot of it towards the end. We were really sort of a tour of England, you know, then to Europe and then to America. I was astonished that we didn't do Japan, actually, because the band did have a kind of a cult following in Japan, and I think nowadays we would have been immediately seen as a band that should have been touring in Japan, but we never went to Japan.
And then the jump then, you then, I think, made on the final Bebop Deluxe album a sort of a statement of intent almost about where you were going to go after that with Drastic Plastic, which was at the time seemed to be quite a stylistic jump from what people had got used to, I suppose, on Sunburst Finish and modern music. Yeah.
Well, I think I think every if you look at it now, you can see that every album is trying out a new idea, and somewhere on the end or somewhere in that album is a clue to the next one. You know, there's always something that afterwards I maybe thought, oh, let's try and do something more emphasising that or whatever. Anyways, moved on. And Drastic Plastic almost didn't happen because after Modern Music I did want to split the band and do something completely different. I felt that we were getting into that situation where unless we played something from every single album we recorded when we did a live concert, people would be disappointed. And it wasn't possible to just go out there and deal with new material, and we were having to go back and repeat and play the old stuff as well. And that's okay because, you know, it's part of the entertainment thing, but if you're at all creative, it can be frustrating. And I had all these other ideas I wanted to try out. So I said to the people who were managing the band at the time, I'd like to try something totally different. I'd like to set up a band that isn't a band, that is totally flexible, that the members can be changed album by album, so that the style changes even more sort of radically. And they said, oh no, it's just starting to achieve some success in America now, you know, bad move, don't do that. And I said, but I really feel strongly about it. And they said, well, do one more album then, and then we'll look at that possibility of a new band. So Drastic Plastic actually was what Red Noise might have been, I guess, at that point in time, before Red Noise happened. And I used the first ever guitar synthesizer on it. Did things like making drum loops and putting them through guitar fuzz boxes, and random tape lyrics crossing over, all kinds of little quirky ideas that I had. And so it was kind of a fusion of an early form of electronica with some rock things. And I'm not sure it was entirely successful, but some of it was. But it's not an album I particularly listen to a lot for some reason. But then I don't listen to much of my stuff after a while anyway.
Because also on that album, it was sort of noticeable. I remember at the time it sort of being saying that you know there are very few guitar solos in there. Your guitar playing seemed to be sort of less emphasis on that rather than the actual style and the songs themselves and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it was more about sort of a kind of storytelling. I mean, it was moving towards that Red Noise thing where I was thinking about kind of dystopian rather than utopian futures that weren't too far away. And it was dealing with kind of, some of the tracks were dealing with alienation and the fact that there's a track called Electrical Language, which sounds positive and everything, but it was really about the fact that people were becoming disconnected and only talking through machines to each other in a way. And on that there was actually a lot of guitar, but it was synthesized guitar, so people didn't hear it as guitar, they heard it as keyboards or something, you know.
So when you finally did with Bebop Deluxe call that a day, you then formed Red Noise, and by that time obviously the new wave and the punk thing had come on.
Just coming on.
And again, to my ears at the time, I think you could hear that some of these musicians had listened to probably what you were doing on the later Bebop Deluxe albums. But Red Noise was very much I think, probably ahead of its time really when it came out. Did that create a lot of problems for you in terms of your relationship with EMI, for example?
Well, it did with Capitol Records in America particularly, because America wasn't quite ready for that kind of thing. And ironically, I thought the songs were really concise, neat, punchy, to the point, and accessible. You know, I thought it was perhaps, if anything, more appealing than bebop. But Capitol Records in America decided when they heard it, they didn't know what to make of it, and they thought, well, okay, let's check it out with DJs around the country. So they sent copies to different radio stations and sent them sheets and said, please comment on what you think and would you play this on the radio and so on. And they wanted to have this survey done before they decide to actually properly release it. And eventually I got to see this survey. It was sort of a telephone directory of all these radio stations right across America. And it was full, I mean, it was so depressing, yet at the same time it was hilarious, because there were comments like, too wacko for us, you know, and what is this crap, you know. And I mean, you know, I laughed at it, but at the same time I'm thinking, you don't get it, it's so obvious, you know. And so Capitol eventually dropped the thing completely. And then around the same time, EMI got taken over by a company called Thorn Lighting Industries, and the whole emphasis at the company changed. It became less music oriented and more sales oriented, and more run by the accountants than the A&R people. And a lot of bands found themselves off the label, including good bands like Wire and myself, you know. And rather than just roll over, I thought, right, okay, indie label, here we go, let's do it ourselves, you know. And I set up Cocteau Records and released a track that I've been recording, Daydream in Colour, on that as a single, first single.
And that got into the lower reaches of the charts as well, didn't it?
It did,
yes,
and we weren't prepared for that. And had we been able to manufacture more and get them out there and have a bit more PR going on behind it, I think we would have had a really successful hit with that record, because it is a kind of a quirky single. And we had to change some of the lyrics for the BBC. There was a line about video junkie looking for a fix, and it wasn't. It was a play on that. It was about somebody who was a TV addict, basically. A video junkie can't pull himself away from the television, and gets his fix from that. But they thought it referred to a heroin fix, and so I can't remember what we changed it, but I had to go in and dub a different line on to try and get some radio play. But by the time we'd done that, I think we'd lost the impetus to some degree.
Well, that eventually, that track eventually came out on your second solo album, I suppose, Quit Dreaming and Get on the Beam. But that was something that had been recorded a while before it actually came out. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, it was recorded for EMI. It was recorded as, originally I was thinking of it as the second Red Noise album. Although Again, it's a different sort of combination. It's mostly me actually on that. A couple of other people play on it, but mostly it's myself. And because of the takeover of EMI and the thing that happened with Capitol, it just sat on EMI shelves unreleased for quite a while. And then I happened to be producing a band at Rockfield who were, I forget, was this Kids, I think. And anyway, a guy called David Bates, who was Phonograms, one of Phonograms A&R men, happened to be in the studio, and he came in and chatted with me and said, "What are you doing these days?" You know, and haven't heard an album from you for a while. And I gave him a cassette of the Quit Dreaming, Get on the Beam album, which, as I say, was on EMI's shelves gathering dust. And he said, "We'll put this out." And they then bought it from EMI and released it. So,
and that became, I think, your most successful album, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, it did very well. And it was, again, a totally different thing to the Red Noise album, stylistically.
And interestingly enough, I know, I think I spoke to you about this before as well, that I think at the time, again, it was one of those albums that was probably a bit too ahead of its time in some ways. What you were doing in those early 80s albums, Quit Dreaming, Getting on the Beam and Love That Whirls, are probably more appreciated now by some of your long-term fans than they were at the time, I think, critically. Well,
I think this is a kind of a recurring theme with my stuff, because even with bebop, we'd find fans saying, "Oh, you know, when modern music came out, oh, it doesn't sound like Sunburst Finish," you know. Well, of course not. You know, that was then, this is now. And it's always been the case. And then somewhere further down the line, they go, "Oh, you know, that was a fantastic album," and you didn't think so at the time, you know. So I've kind of got used to it. People do take a while to just adjust, I think, to the changes. You know.
But unlike a lot of artists, I think, who'd started a career in the sort of early 70s, you managed to, I think, adapt, because being one step of the game stylistically to some extent, you managed to adapt to the changes that were going on in the 80s very well, I think. And you ended up producing a lot of bands as well around that sort of late 70s, early 80s period. How did you get involved in production with other artists?
I mean, basically, you know, being approached by them to do that. I never felt out of step with the attitude of punk. You know, the idea that when the punk thing came along, that it could be independent of the mainstream industry, that it could open out the possibility for all kinds of music to come forward. The only thing that disappointed me to a degree was that the music itself kind of sounded still like fairly straight rock and roll to me. The post-punk thing got more interesting, because then, I don't know quite how that came about, but there seemed to be people coming up with more interesting ideas. And it opened out, and for a while it felt that there was almost like a salon atmosphere where people collaborated, and it was kind of a group of people against the world, almost in a slightly different way to the way that where punk was kind of aggressively so. This was artistically so. It was culturally a change, if I can say it properly. And so I felt an affinity. You know, I didn't feel like some of the rock bands that come before saw that whole thing as a threat. I didn't feel that it was a threat. I felt it was an interesting time and something that I could contribute towards. And always you reflect in the time anyway. You know, any artist, it's very difficult to work in total isolation from what's going on around you, and those things come into your work and they go through your own personal filters, and then it comes out as whatever it is. So I was kind of very much in touch with what was going on around me as well, and that influenced or inspired certain things too.
And around this period as well, I suppose in the early 80s, Cocteau sort of took off to the next level as well, where you were doing, eventually your work came out on your own label, and you had various sort of collections of home recordings, I think, came out alongside albums for major labels. And with Cocteau, did you always see that as an idea to sort of maybe try and nurture other artists as well, or find other artists too when you set it up?
I did initially. I mean, I had this sort of very idealistic thing that it would be a showcase for a lot of artists that I liked, that might then, you know, be picked up by somebody that could do something more serious with them. And I kind of initially promoted it as such, you know, send me your demo tapes. And of course, suddenly you're snowed under with tapes. And I suddenly realised exactly how hard it is to be an A&R man, you know, and sort through everything. And I did find some interesting things and put a few things out. And a couple of them went on to do, you know, I mean, one band called A Flock of Seagulls. And I did their first single on Cocteau. And they got signed up by a major company and then ended up being very successful, particularly in America, I think. And then there was a band I was very fond of called Man Jumping. They originally had been called The Lost Jockey. And they were a kind of a collective of modernist avant-garde composers working together and playing together. And it was kind of a combination of things like some of the things that you might hear from Steve Reich of Philip Glass, with a bit of ambient, kind of Brian Eno-esque touches to it. In fact, Brian Eno was a huge fan of this band. And I just thought they were fantastic. And we did an album on Cocteau, which, you know, those people who knew about that stuff raved about, but it was never going to be a commercial success. But but after a while, it just became too much to think about doing these other things, and I needed to concentrate more on my own thing. So it became narrower and more focused on my music.
And you're mentioning ambient music. I mean, your work focused a lot on the ambient side of things at that period as well, and some of the releases, the interesting releases you did, like sort of Das Cabinet or whatever. Did you find that a sort of a healthy outlet for that side of your musical character?
Yeah, I mean, I you know, when I was an art student in the 60s, I remember doing a soundtrack for a play that the college put on of Ibsen's Peer Gynt, and I'd been reading up in the college library about John Cage and his prepared piano techniques, and I thought, oh, that might work on guitar. So I was putting sort of nails, threading them through the strings of the guitar, and pieces of glass, and hitting it with mallets, and recording it, and chopping the tape up, and reversing it. And I made a soundtrack, a very abstract soundtrack for this this college production of Ibsen's Peer Gynt. And that would be 65 or something like that, 1965. So when, you know, when the technology opened up, when synthesizers became affordable, it just seemed that there was a whole new palette of sounds I could play with, and it just opened out all these other areas for me. And I've never felt that it should just go down one avenue. The kind of music I make does cover a lot of things because I'm interested in a lot of music. That reflects through the music I make. So there's times when it's straight guitar stuff, there's times when it's jazzy, there's times when it's folky, times when it's bluesy, times when it's experimental. It's all music, and the barriers between are often set up more for marketing purposes, I think, than they are for artistic ones.
Yes. You know. By the mid-80s as well, you or in 1986, you had an album, Getting the Holy Ghost Across, which was sort of a return to a major label for you at that point. The album came out in a different format in the States.
Yes, it did.
Could you explain why that happened and why it came out under a different title?
Well, it's, you know, it's a typical tale of America, I guess, because there was a chain of record stores in America that, as I understand it, were owned by fundamentalist, quite right-wing Christian, you know, a company. And the album title, for a start, Getting the Holy Ghost Across, I mean, it was a kind of a play on a cross in the Christian sense, but getting across an idea. And I was very interested at that time and involved in some esoteric pursuits to do with what's known as the Western mystery tradition that involves alchemy and fringe Freemasonry and occultism and so on. Some of these ideas that I had and things I'd been studying found their way into this particular album's imagery. And I'd used some old Masonic secret writing around the edge of the album sleeve, which actually translated just said the name of the album and my name, nothing more than that. But the record company in America felt that this was going to be a dangerous thing to release in the States with this cover, because for one thing, this chain of record stores probably wouldn't stock it, because they would interpret that as some kind of, I don't know, black magic or whatever, you know. And I explained what it was. It's absolutely innocent. It's actually quite a lofty thing, you know, the ideas behind this. It's nothing dark. But it had to be changed. So I came up with the title On a Blue Wing instead, and they came up with a cover. It's an abstract painting. So it had a completely different feel for America, the cover. But the problem was that when I went over there to promote it, a lot of the journalists had actually realised, because they'd seen pictures of the English version, and said, well, why is it a different title and a different cover, but the same music, you know? And I had to explain it. So that drew even more attention to the esoteric nature of it, you know. So, yeah, it was quite a funny thing, yeah.
So after that album came out, you then concentrated again on releasing your work on Cocteau. And by about sort of 1990, the Cocteau thing, for various reasons, ceased to exist. So what were you doing at that time in terms of finding yourself without a record label home? What did you do at that point to sort of?
Well, there's a lot going on. I mean, the behind the scenes stuff to do with the actual the business nature of things. And problems I had with management, and eventually, as a result of a lot of that, it contributed towards what was already a sort of a failing marriage, you know. So there were problems personally on all kinds of sides. You know, it was a difficult time, a very difficult time. And I ended up moving to Japan for a year. I got involved with producing Roger Eno, an album of Roger's called The Familiar, and on that album was Kate St. John, and we got on well together and decided that at one point, it actually came from the record company that released that album, All Saints, that perhaps we could put a group together around Roger. And we did some dates in Japan. And then, as a result of that, the idea was that maybe we should do something purely under this name, a different name, not as a Roger album, but as a group album, and under the name Channel Light Vessel.
Yes.
So we recorded this, and then I was living in Japan. I'd gone to live with Emiko, who became my wife in '93. And we'd left the album for someone else to mix, but the record label weren't happy with the mix they'd done. And they spoke to me and said, would I be interested in having a go at trying to finish the thing off? So I came back from Japan and did some work on that, and actually took it into a studio near Hull, and got Kate up to do some vocals with me. We put some vocals on it, we put some percussion, altered some of the things, took certain things and magnified them and made other things sort of less obvious, and ended up with a very nice album actually. It worked really well. So there was this transition period where I was doing things, collaborating with other people. Harold Budd as well I'd done some work with prior to Channel Light Vessel. At the very start of the 90s, I think, in New Orleans at Daniel Lanois' studio. So there was a lot of things going on, but there was a lot of personal stuff behind the scenes that was making all kinds of problems for me, you know. So it's a bit of a blur now looking back on it. Maybe I've blocked some of it out because it was uncomfortable, but came out the other side okay. So and you know, never stopped making music despite all that. So.
Yeah, because sort of from the sort of the mid to late 90s onwards, and you became increasingly prolific, really, with what you were doing, and I would say now you're probably more prolific than you've ever been in terms of
I sometimes wonder whether it's a good thing or a healthy thing, you know, because I do I tend to approach recording on a sort of daily basis. You know, I go and clock on at a certain time in the studio at home, and I'll work until I feel I've exhausted the day's ideas. And that's, you know, 7 days a week. So a lot of material piles up, and then at a certain point I'll decide to sort through things and see what I've got. And you'll often find unconsciously that there's an album assembled itself. When you were recording, you didn't realise it was going to be an album because you did a track and then you did another track. But then that one goes with this one up here, and that one fits with one further down the line. And you gradually put them together and albums emerge. So sometimes I've completed 6 albums which is the most I've done in 1 year. And now that I've got, you know, since the digital thing happened with recording, I can get a much better finish on everything. So it actually sounds, some of the stuff I do now sounds better than the stuff I did in the 70s in major studios, technically, you know, because the equipment allows you to do that at home. So I'm very, you know, the studio is where I live. That's where my heart is more than live performing. I just love that idea of it's painting pictures with sound. And it's back to what I intended to do with a brush and paint, but it's sound.
And you have that very direct contact with your fan base. People order the CDs directly from your website. That's how they get your things, and it's a very much a. I think in a way you were a pioneer of that kind of approach that more and more people seem to be doing these days. It must be incredibly time consuming though at the same time doing everything yourself. It
is, yeah. And I do have moments when I wish I had more space and I could bring a drum kit in and a drummer and so on. But you know, I'm a firm believer that if you have a strong creative idea, regardless of the limitations of equipment or even your own technical ability, you'll find a way to get that across, because it won't let you sleep until you've done it. It's that idea of having a vision of some kind, you know. And people often ask me about equipment and technique and so on, and I always just say, well, you know, you can't buy the idea. You've got to have something deep inside you that you have to get across that won't let you be. If you've got that, even if you've got, you know, a banjo and a cassette machine, you'll get a strong idea across, and people will be able to pick up on that and relate to it in some way. So it's not about, you know, facilities. It's about ideas.
And now, of course, the box set, The Practice of Everyday Life, is coming out. It's quite a task compiling such a diverse collection of material on there, which you've done. How do you actually view having your life's work collected in that kind of way?
Well, I'm very proud to have that, you know, because I'm glad that someone's felt that was something worth putting together and putting out. But it is, I mean, I don't put my own records on at home for pleasure. If I happen to have a concert to do where some old material might be needed, I have to then dig it out and relearn everything again. But, you know, once an album's finished and it's gone and it's out there, I very rarely listen to it again. So going through the box set was kind of partly a traumatic experience, because not just the amount, but how do we put that together? Do we do it chronologically, or do we try and theme it, you know, an album of purely experimental stuff, an album of rock guitar solos, whatever. And once you start getting away from it just being chronological, I think it becomes a more complicated and difficult task, because then you're matching things. And so in the end, as you know, we went for a chronological approach, which at least takes you from the beginning up to date. And you can see the progression, hopefully. You can see where the ideas jump up a step and go along. So yeah, it's great to have it all gathered together like that, and particularly in a package that has got such a strong visual sense. The book that's going to be in the package has a potted history, really, of my recording career in there, and it's something that I'm sure anyone who's, you know, been a fan of my music at different points will be able to connect the dots and see the whole story. I think it'll be a very entertaining object to have, you know, not just the music, but the actual visual side of it will be very fulfilling, I think.
And what does the future hold for you, do you think?
Oh gosh, well, you know, I mean, age is something that increasingly I notice, you know, energy levels and all the rest of it, and the idea of touring is something which I should do more, really, but I often will look for reasons not to do. Not just because of being older, but because of wanting to keep a certain standard. And unfortunately, you know, to do things to a certain standard, it costs money to hire good musicians to present things in a nice venue where people are comfortable and can properly take it in and so on. And those aren't always, you know, easy come by in current times, the economy being what it is and so on. So, but I'm hoping to do something next year. There's always the possibility of doing some solo dates, which I do once in a while anyway. But there's always more music. You know, the recording side of it is, at the moment, open-ended. I mean, I never feel short of an idea to start the day off. So hopefully that'll continue, you know, even if the touring is infrequent.
So after 40 years, you're still inspired to create?
Yeah, I'm still looking for a record I can feel really proud of, which, you know, whilst there's been some good stuff and some okay stuff, I've not yet hit that personal bullseye where I can go, that's it, that's the one. Now I can stop. You know? So I'm waiting for the big one. Yeah.
Well, Bill, thanks very much for your time, and thanks for talking to us on Cherry Red TV today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Mark. Thanks.